It was just after 8 in the morning when I got the text, and I remember that because I'd just poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down on the front steps of my trailer, the Arizona sun already creeping up with that hot, hazy promise that it was going to be another scorcher of a day. My old dog Lucky was snoring next to me, and the hummingbirds were already dive-bombing the feeder I'd filled the night before. It should have been a quiet, forgettable morning, just like every other morning since I'd started living out here alone. But then my phone buzzed. Just one single message. From my son. The insurance paid out. You're dead on paper now. At first, I just stared at it. The words not even making sense. I thought maybe it was a joke, some twisted prank I didn't understand, or maybe my son had meant to text someone else, maybe autocorrect mangled whatever message he was trying to send. But the longer I looked at the screen, the colder my hands felt, the coffee cooling fast in my lap like it had turned to ice. I read it again and again. You're dead on paper now. You know that feeling when something inside you shifts, like a floor giving way beneath your feet, but your body hasn't caught up yet? That's what it felt like. I wasn't scared, not yet. I was confused, then offended, then just plain stunned. Why would my only child say something like that to me? And what did he mean by the insurance paid out? I hadn't been to a doctor in years, hadn't had any serious health issues, hadn't been in an accident. Hell, I'd barely left the damn trailer park in months. How could I be dead to anyone? I called him right away, of course. I hit call with my thumb, hands shaking now, heart thumping like a drum in my chest. It rang once, then twice, then went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. By the third call, I could barely breathe. I sent him a message. What the hell are you talking about, Brian? Call me now. No reply. Not then, not later. In fact, I haven't heard his voice since. I sat there for the longest time, the phone heavy in my hand, watching the sunlight crawl across the dirt like it didn't care that my world had just split in half. I kept trying to think of what I'd done to deserve that kind of message. Was this some cruel metaphor? Did he mean I was dead to him, emotionally? We'd been distant, sure, and we hadn't always seen eye to eye, but I'd still sent him birthday cards, still called at Christmas, still loved him like only a mother could love a child who didn't want anything to do with her anymore. I kept his baby pictures in a shoebox under my bed. I still remembered the feel of his tiny fingers curling around mine when he was a newborn. No matter what came between us, nothing could erase that. So why would he say something like that? I didn't know what to do. I felt paralyzed, like even standing up would cause me to collapse. That message kept blinking in my brain like a warning sign. My instincts started kicking in. The kind of instincts you develop when you've been through hell before. I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I needed answers. So I got up, poured out the cold coffee, threw on some jeans and my old denim jacket, locked Lucky inside with some kibble and the fan blowing his way, and I got in my car. My license might have been expired, but I wasn't about to let that stop me, not when something this serious was going on. I had to find out what Brian meant. I had to understand how I could be alive and breathing in my own damn body, yet somehow, legally or financially or God knows how, be considered dead. I started at the post office. The lady behind the counter, Miss Carla, recognized me from church potlucks and bingo nights. So when I asked if I'd received any mail recently, anything official looking, maybe even a death certificate, she gave me a look like I'd lost my marbles. "Honey, why would you have a death certificate?" she asked, chuckling softly. I told her about the text, showed her the message, and that smile disappeared right off her face. "You need to get yourself to the DMV and maybe a lawyer," she said, her voice dropping low, serious now. "If someone's declaring you dead when you ain't, that's not just weird, that's criminal." I thanked her and drove straight to the nearest DMV, an hour and 20 minutes away in Tucson, ignoring the growing ache in my chest and the scratch of anxiety in my throat. The air conditioning in the car was barely functional, and I was sweating by the time I walked through those sliding glass doors and took a number. When it was finally my turn, I stepped up to the counter and said, as plainly as I could, "I think someone declared me dead." The woman behind the counter, who looked barely 20 and had bright blue hair pulled into a bun, blinked at me like I'd spoken another language. "Excuse me?" she said. I handed her my ID and repeated it, slower this time. "My son texted me this morning saying the insurance paid out. He said I'm dead on paper. I want to know what that means." She typed my name into the computer. Then she frowned. Then she clicked something else. Her face changed, not in a dramatic, over-the-top way, but subtly, like she was trying to keep her expression neutral and couldn't quite manage it. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "According to our system, you've been marked deceased 2 weeks ago. Cause of death, cardiac arrest." I felt like someone had pulled the air out of the room. "That's not possible," I whispered. "I'm standing right here. If someone had told me a few months ago that my own child would go so far as to fake my death, forge documents, collect money, and essentially erase me from the world without so much as a warning or an ounce of hesitation, I might have laughed, not because I thought he was incapable of something that cruel, but because the very idea of being worth that kind of effort to anyone, let alone my son, seemed like a twisted kind of compliment wrapped in betrayal. The truth is, I had already gotten used to being forgotten, to living outside the edges of everyone else's lives, to being the kind of person no one calls, no one visits, no one remembers unless they're looking for someone to blame or borrow from or unload their guilt onto. And in some small, stubborn way, I had made peace with that quiet kind of existence, because at least it didn't come with shouting or slamming doors or begging someone to stay, when you already know they've left you in every way that matters. Out in the desert, in my little trailer with the busted screen door and the uneven porch steps and the collection of ceramic owls I picked up from yard sales over the years, life had settled into a rhythm that didn't require anyone else's approval or presence, just the rise and fall of the sun, the smell of dust and creosote after a rare summer rain, the hum of the fan pushing warm air through the narrow hallway at night, and the comforting weight of Lucky curled up against my legs, as if he, too, had decided that we were enough for each other, no matter who else had walked away. I paid my bills late, but paid them all the same. Cooked simple meals that filled the space with the smell of garlic and onion, sat on the porch most evenings with a glass of sweet tea and the sound of cicadas for company, and tried not to think too hard about the years I'd lost to bitterness, grief, and the kind of love that turns sour in your mouth when you try to speak it aloud. Brian hadn't been a part of that rhythm for a long time, and the last real conversation we'd had, the kind that leaves you drained and shaky for days afterward, had ended with a long silence that stretched across the years like a dried-up riverbed, not because either of us didn't know what to say, but because everything we needed to say had already been said, and none of it had fixed anything. He had his reasons, I'm sure, though none of them ever made their way to me, and over time, I stopped hoping for reconciliation and started focusing on survival, because when you're a woman who's already lost more than she cares to count, survival becomes your specialty, your mantra, your way of spitting in the face of everything that tried to bury you before your time. So when that message came, when the DMV clerk confirmed what the system said about me, when I heard that phrase, "marked deceased 2 weeks ago, cause of death listed as cardiac arrest," it wasn't just the shock of it that got to me. It was the cruel accuracy of it, as if someone had reached inside me and written down the truth I'd never dared to admit, that my heart had already stopped beating in the ways that mattered a long time ago, that maybe I had been dead to Brian for years before he ever made it official, and that this wasn't just an act of fraud, it was a kind of symbolic execution, a final, deliberate unmaking of who I was and what I meant. The ride home was a blur, the sun now higher in the sky, beating down through the cracked windshield, the tires humming against the hot asphalt like a warning I couldn't quite hear. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't cry. I just drove with one hand on the wheel and the other clenched tight in my lap, trying to hold on to something solid even though everything inside me felt like it was turning to smoke. The silence was deafening in a new way, not peaceful anymore, but dense and heavy and crawling with questions that had no good answers, the kind that sit at the back of your throat and burn like swallowed glass. Back at the trailer, Lucky greeted me with his usual slow tail wag, unaware that the world had shifted beneath our feet, and I sat down on the edge of the couch without even taking off my shoes, staring at the wall like it might offer up a solution, some next step that would make all of this make sense. I had no idea what to do next. I didn't have a lawyer, didn't have money for one either, didn't have anyone in my life I trusted enough to tell them what was happening, and even if I did, how do you explain something like this without sounding like you've lost your mind? Hi, it's me, Maggie. Apparently I died 2 weeks ago, and my son just collected a life insurance payout on a death that didn't happen. Would you like to grab coffee and discuss? I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my own name printed in black ink on some cold document in a file somewhere, listed among the dead, crossed out like a canceled appointment, and the rage that was starting to take shape inside me felt unfamiliar and sharp, like picking up a knife you'd long forgotten you owned. For the first time in years, I didn't feel numb or invisible. I felt like something had been lit inside me, something fierce and terrible and alive. And though I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke up before the sun even touched the edge of the horizon. The air in the trailer so still and thick, it felt like the world was holding its breath right along with me. And I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to gather the kind of courage that doesn't come from pep talks or coffee or grit, but from something deeper, older, something that's been buried under years of silence and disappointment and pain that never quite scabbed over. I didn't have a plan yet, but I knew I couldn't just sit there and let someone else write the story of my life, or my death, without my say in it. And so I got up, showered, dressed, fed Lucky, and packed a bag with every document I still had that proved I existed, including my birth certificate, an old tax return, a photo of me holding Brian as a baby, and the faded hospital bracelet from the night he was born, because part of me felt like maybe I needed to remind the world, and myself, that I had lived, that I had mattered, that I was real. I drove back into Tucson with my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached, the road stretching ahead like a dare, and somewhere along the way, as I passed a dry riverbed and a gas station with a half-broken sign that used to say, "God is watching," I realized that I wasn't just angry. I was terrified in a way I hadn't let myself feel in a long, long time, because if the system said I was dead, then how far would it go to keep me that way? And what if the man I gave birth to, the one I once sang to sleep and kissed on the forehead after nightmares, was willing to go even further than fraud to make sure I stayed gone? I parked outside the county clerk's office in a lot half full of sunburned cars and dusty trucks, my heart pounding as I walked through the glass doors into a space that smelled like ink, sweat, and old carpet. And I waited in a stiff plastic chair with my little bag of proof clutched to my chest like a lifeline, watching the clock tick down the minutes like each one was asking me if I still had time to turn back. When my number was called, I stood up too fast and nearly stumbled, catching myself on the edge of a desk, my voice steadier than I felt as I explained that I needed a copy of my own death certificate, which made the woman behind the desk glance at me with a half-raised eyebrow and ask for my ID. And when I handed it to her, she frowned just like the clerk at the DMV had, tapping keys and squinting at the screen before finally going quiet for so long that I felt the panic begin to crawl up my spine again like a cold hand made of static and dread. She asked me to wait while she went to get her supervisor, and that's when I noticed a man across the room, tall, wearing sunglasses indoors, leaning against a filing cabinet like he belonged there. But every now and then, his eyes flicked to me, and something about the way he didn't look away, the way his jaw twitched when I met his gaze, made every hair on my arms stand up. I couldn't explain it, not really, but it felt like danger, not loud or obvious, but quiet and patient and waiting. And the longer he stood there, the more certain I became that he wasn't just another guy waiting for forms or stamps or whatever else people came here for. He was watching me, like he knew who I was or who I wasn't supposed to be anymore. The supervisor finally came out with the clerk in tow, a folder in her hand and a look that was neither friendly nor hostile, just professionally blank, and she told me, in the kind of tone that people use when they're trying not to show fear or judgment, that according to their records, I had been declared deceased with the signature of a state-licensed physician, a coroner's verification, and next of kin confirmation, all processed and approved. My name, my birthday, my social security number, all of it. And when I asked who had filed the paperwork, she hesitated for a second too long before saying she wasn't legally allowed to disclose that without a court order. I felt the walls closing in, the air too tight to breathe, my hands shaking so badly I had to grip the chair behind me. And just when I thought I might actually faint or scream or do something that would get me escorted out by security, the man in sunglasses shifted his weight and took a step toward me. Not fast, not aggressive, just slow and deliberate, like someone testing the water before diving in. And I could feel the blood drain from my face as every instinct I had screamed that he wasn't just some bystander, that maybe, just maybe, he was connected to this in a way I didn't yet understand. But then, just as suddenly, he turned and walked away, slipping out the side door without a glance back, leaving me frozen in place with my pulse hammering in my ears and the distinct nauseating realization that I might not be as invisible as I thought I was, that maybe someone was making sure I stayed dead, or at least stayed quiet. The supervisor told me to come back with a lawyer if I wanted to pursue a formal dispute of my status, and I nodded like I understood. But in truth, I barely heard her through the roaring in my head. I stumbled back to my car like someone walking away from a fire they hadn't realized they'd started, sat behind the wheel for a long time with my keys in my lap, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror like I didn't recognize the woman looking back. A woman who was legally dead but too angry, too hurt, too alive to stay that way. When I got back home that evening, everything around me felt strangely quiet, almost mockingly normal, as if the world outside hadn't noticed that in the span of a single day, I'd been informed of my so-called official death, shown documents verifying that someone had signed and approved a list of falsehoods and effectively stripped me of my legal existence, transforming me from a living, breathing woman into a file marked complete. A story with an ending I never agreed to. I sat down at the edge of the bed, still wearing the same clothes I'd had on all day, feeling the weight of fatigue and fury twisting inside me like opposing tides. And it suddenly hit me that this wasn't just a clerical error or some careless bureaucratic oversight. This was a carefully built lie, constructed step by step, line by line, signature by signature, designed to wipe me out like an outdated record no one wanted anymore. I pulled out every scrap of paperwork I still had. My old ID, birth certificate, social security card, old tax forms, even a faded hospital bracelet from the night Brian was born. Not because I thought these papers would magically restore my place in the world, but because I needed to see them with my own eyes, to remind myself that I had existed, that I wasn't crazy, that I had a history, a name, a life, and that someone had decided, with full intention, to erase that life because it was more profitable for me to be dead than alive. I stayed up late going through everything, reviewing each document like it was a sacred relic, trying to remember when I last updated my information, when I had last spoken about my affairs, when I had been careless enough to trust the wrong person. And of course, there was only one person who had ever had access to all of it. Brian. He knew where I kept my records. He knew my full name, my birthday, my old addresses, my health information, even my old passwords and security answers. And what made my stomach turn was remembering the moment years ago when, in one of those rare and hopeful attempts at reconnecting, I had foolishly told him about the life insurance policy I'd taken out. A small one, barely enough to bury a person and pay off a little debt. Something I thought of as a final kindness to a son who hadn't shown me kindness in years. I told him about it because back then I still believed that no matter how far apart we were, a mother's gesture might still carry weight. He remembered. He had waited, not weeks, not months, but years, biding his time until I distanced myself just enough from everything and everyone to make it possible. And then he moved, methodically, strategically, like someone filling in blanks on a form, assembling a false narrative and making it real with the stroke of a pen. I could see it clearly now. He'd claimed I died, submitted the paperwork, forged signatures if he had to, maybe even convinced someone to help him push it through. In a town like this, where small favors and whispered agreements travel faster than facts, it wouldn't take much. He'd gotten his payout. He'd done it. And I'd been left staring at screens, holding papers, listening to strangers tell me I no longer existed. I called the insurance company the next day, even though everything inside me screamed that they would turn me away. And of course, when I gave them my name, the response was cold and calculated. They couldn't discuss the account of a deceased client without legal verification from the beneficiary. I tried to explain, keeping the panic out of my voice as best I could, that I was alive, that this was fraud, that this was theft, but the woman on the other end of the line didn't budge. Still, something in her pause, a long, quiet hesitation before she spoke again, made me wonder if she knew more than she could say, if perhaps she'd seen enough oddities in the file to recognize that something wasn't right, but couldn't speak openly. Her tone shifted just slightly, softer but distant, and she suggested that I appear in person with legal documentation, maybe with a representative. It might have been nothing, or it might have been her quiet way of telling me to fight harder. I decided I would go the very next morning. I got up early, dressed in a clean shirt, ran a brush through my hair while staring at the face in the mirror. A face that didn't look scared or tired anymore, but sharp, focused, filled with a kind of calm rage I hadn't felt in years. I stepped outside into the warm air, locked up behind me, made sure Lucky had food and water, then headed to the car, bag in hand, ready to drive into the next round of this quiet war. But as I reached the gate, I saw a white Camry parked just down the road, tucked near the edge of the lot where the dirt met the pavement. It wasn't a neighbor's car. I'd never seen it before. It sat there like it belonged, dusty and unremarkable, except for the strange stillness around it. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from something empty, but something watching. I couldn't see inside, couldn't make out any faces, but everything in my body stiffened. I knew someone was in there. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it, like a weight in the air. I didn't stop. I didn't stare. I kept walking, heart pounding. Keys clutched tightly in my palm, breath stuck somewhere between throat and chest, and with every step I took, I wondered if this was the moment something terrible was going to happen. If I'd pushed too far, if someone had been sent to make sure I stayed dead, not just on paper, but in the most permanent way. But nothing happened. The door opened. The car started. I pulled away. I took the long way out of the park, circling back once through a side street just to check again, and when I looked back, the white car was gone, vanished as silently as it had appeared. I told myself it was a coincidence, a random car, a harmless presence, but I didn't believe it. I knew better. Something had begun, something bigger than I'd anticipated, and if Brian thought this was the end of my story, if he truly believed that I would just vanish quietly, then he had made the gravest mistake of his life. The days that followed became a strange, slow-motion descent into a version of my life I barely recognized, like stepping through a mirror into a world where everything looked the same, but nothing behaved the way it should, and it started with the smallest details. The kind of everyday tasks that never used to require thought, like checking my balance at the bank, picking up a prescription, or simply confirming an appointment with the power company, all of which now led to long silences, confused glances, and eventually the cold realization that as far as the system was concerned, I no longer had the right to participate in the world I'd been living in all along. There was no dramatic scene, no alarms blaring or doors slamming in my face, just a quiet unraveling, one interaction at a time, as the things I took for granted were slowly stripped away, and in their place came a suffocating bureaucratic void that refused to recognize me, no matter how alive I felt inside my skin. The first real blow landed when I stopped by my bank to withdraw what little I had left in my savings, not because I planned to run, but because I needed to feel some kind of control, something that still belonged to me, even if it was just 100 crumpled bills. But the moment the teller scanned my ID, her polite smile faltered, her eyes flicking across the screen with that flicker of alarm I was beginning to recognize. And then everything stalled. She excused herself quietly and stepped away, leaving me standing there in that air-conditioned, beige-tiled limbo, surrounded by potted plants and outdated brochures, waiting for someone to decide whether I was a person or a problem. She came back eventually, accompanied by a manager who spoke to me in that carefully measured tone people use when they're not sure whether they're dealing with a mistake or a mental breakdown. And though no one said the word directly, I heard it loud and clear in their eyes. Deceased. And even louder in their final refusal to give me access to my own funds, as if I'd asked for something absurd, rather than something I'd spent years earning with every weary hour worked and every sacrifice made when no one else was around to see it. I left the bank shaking, not with anger, not yet, but with the surreal sensation of being peeled away from my own name, like someone had taken an eraser to everything that made me legally real and left me standing in the sun as a shadow of who I used to be. And when I stopped by the pharmacy that same afternoon, clutching the bottle of my last refill like a relic, I was met with the same quiet resistance, the same lowered eyes and stammered apologies, the same invisible wall that now stood between me and everything I'd once relied on. Blood pressure meds, allergy pills, even the simple act of being greeted by name. They didn't see me? Not really. They saw a gap in the system, a glitch, a contradiction they couldn't fix. And so they pushed me aside gently but completely, and I walked back to my car feeling like the world had tipped slightly off balance, just enough to make me question whether I was still standing on solid ground. I tried calling Social Security the next morning, hoping to reach a human voice that might offer some kind of path forward. But every automated option led me in circles. Each keypad pressed a reminder that I didn't belong in their system anymore. And when I finally attempted to verify my identity online, the website locked me out before I could even finish typing my own name, flashing red text across the screen like a final denial. No match found, no account exists, no record remains. And in that moment, sitting there at my little kitchen table with the sun slanting through the dusty blinds and Lucky snoring by my feet, I felt the weight of it crash down on me all at once. The enormity of being erased, not just on paper, but in every way that matters when you live in a world that runs on numbers, signatures, and screens. I tried the sheriff's office next, hoping against reason that maybe someone there would listen, would understand that this wasn't a misunderstanding, but a deliberate act, a fraud, a theft not just of money, but of my identity, my dignity, my right to exist. I waited almost an hour in a hard plastic chair under a flickering light, surrounded by old magazines and the low hum of printers. And when I finally sat across from a deputy whose name I can't remember, he listened with the same polite skepticism I was coming to expect, the kind that's all nods and furrowed brows but no real action. And by the end of it, all he offered was a referral to a county fraud hotline and a reminder to bring proper documentation, even though I had already explained that my documentation was exactly what had been destroyed. I walked out of that building feeling smaller than I had in years, and by the time I reached the parking lot, my hands were trembling so badly I dropped my keys and had to kneel down in the gravel to find them, my breath catching in my chest like something sharp had lodged behind my ribs. I didn't cry, not right then. The tears came later, behind the wheel with the windows rolled up and the desert wind gusting through the cracked vents, and they didn't come in sobs, but in heavy, silent waves, the kind that leave your face wet and your throat raw without ever making a sound. And as I sat there, gripping the wheel like it was the last real thing I could touch, I began to realize that this wasn't going to go away on its own, that no one was coming to fix it, that the only way I would get my life back was if I took it back piece by piece, clawed it back from the hands that had stolen it, no matter what it cost me or what I had to uncover to get there. And somewhere underneath all that pain and humiliation, something began to shift. A stillness at first, then a slow growing heat, not just anger, but something older, deeper. Something I had buried under years of silence and submission. Something that felt like strength returning to a body that had been asleep for too long. I might have been a ghost in their system, but I wasn't a ghost in my own skin. And if they thought I would simply disappear, fade quietly into nothing, they were going to learn the truth the hard way. I was not done yet, and I would not go down without making them feel every inch of what they had tried to take from me. It's a strange thing, the way memory behaves when you're pushed to the edge, not like a file cabinet that opens neatly and offers what you need in labeled folders, but more like a dust storm sweeping in out of nowhere, blinding and choking and sudden, stirring up things you thought you'd buried for good. And that morning, as I sat at the kitchen table staring at the same cold cup of coffee I'd reheated 3 times but couldn't bring myself to drink, the past came rushing in with a weight that nearly flattened me, and I knew, deep in my bones, that if I wanted to understand how Brian could have done what he did, not just the paperwork and the lies and the theft, but the decision to erase me entirely, I'd have to go back further than just the last few years of silence and disappointment, back before the distance, before the arguments, before the brittle phone calls and missed holidays, back to the version of us I stopped speaking about, even to myself. I didn't want to go there. Not because I'd forgotten, but because remembering meant reopening wounds I had worked so hard to keep closed, wounds that had scabbed over into something hard and quiet and manageable, the kind you carry without letting anyone see the limp. But now, there was no avoiding it. Because this wasn't just about stolen money or fake documents, it was about the long, slow rot that started somewhere back in the life we shared before it all broke apart. And if I was going to put my life back together, I needed to understand just how deep the damage went, and how much of it I had helped create, even if I didn't want to admit it. I hadn't spoken to Brian's father in over a decade, not since the last time I saw him drunk and leaning against the doorframe of his trailer with that lazy, bitter smirk that always made my skin crawl. The kind of man who thought silence was power, and violence was just another form of communication. And though he had disappeared from Brian's life when our son was still in middle school, his shadow had never really left us, lingering in the corners of every fight Brian and I ever had, in every bitter word and slammed door, in every time I raised my voice and saw something flash across Brian's face that didn't belong to me. For years I tried to tell myself I had protected him from the worst of it, that by leaving I had saved us both. But when someone grows up inside a storm, they learn to crave the wind, and even after the damage is done, part of them still listens for the thunder. I spent the afternoon calling around, following half-remembered leads, scraps of gossip from old neighbors, vague Facebook mentions from names I hadn't seen in years. And by sunset, I had an address, a trailer park 3 counties over, the kind of place where people go when they're too tired to run but too stubborn to die. And even though I hadn't seen him in so long, I wasn't surprised to hear he was still around, still scraping by, still breathing, still loud enough to leave a trail. I didn't want to see him. God knows I didn't. But something in my gut told me that Brian hadn't come up with this scheme on his own. Not the details, not the timing, not the boldness. And if anyone had planted the seeds of betrayal in him, it was the man who taught him that love was something you could twist into a weapon and use when convenient. The drive was long and endless, the kind that stretches through miles of sunburnt silence, where the desert flattens into something that doesn't feel real anymore, and the road ahead becomes a question instead of a direction. With every mile, I felt something old rise up inside me. Not fear exactly, but the weight of memory, the kind that curls in your chest like smoke from something that never fully cooled. When I arrived, I found the trailer just as I remembered. Leaning porch, sun-faded siding, a dish half hanging from the roof. And I parked across the street with my heart thudding in my chest, not because I feared him anymore, but because I knew this visit would pull something from the past into the present. He looked older, smaller, like the years had chipped away at the rough edges he once used like weapons. But there was still something in his eyes, that distant, calculating stare that always made the air colder when he entered a room. I told him what had happened, not because I wanted understanding, but because I needed to see his reaction. And he didn't flinch. He just listened, quiet, unmoved, and when he finally spoke, the words landed with the kind of weight that comes from someone who isn't surprised, someone who had already seen it coming, maybe even welcomed it. That's when I knew he had known. Not the details, perhaps, but the shape of it. He had always known who Brian was becoming, and maybe, in his own way, had helped shape that version of him. Not directly, but through stories, comments, lessons passed down in silence. He said things about Brian, about how he never liked being told no, how he always needed to win, how he saw vulnerability as weakness. And when he laughed, low and dry, it was the kind of laugh that told me everything. This wasn't a tragedy to him. It was a confirmation. I left in silence, and as I drove back through the fading light, the sky bruised and wide above me, something shifted again, not in the world, but in me. A new awareness settled in. This wasn't just about what Brian had done. This was the final chapter in a longer story. One that had started long before the text message, long before the signatures, long before I ever thought about what it meant to disappear. That night, I didn't really sleep. I drifted in and out, my thoughts circling like birds over a field that had already burned. I kept waking with that feeling, not panic, not quite, but a kind of cold realization that the betrayal wasn't new. It had simply matured. And the more I sat with it, the more I started looking backward. Not to the loud moments, but to the quiet ones. The evenings filled with silence at the dinner table, the way Brian watched his father for cues, trying to mirror his tone before he could understand the words. I remembered how he used to stand in the hallway, always listening, always learning. And even when we left, even after I tried to build us something new, something separate, I realize now that not everything came with us. Some things stayed, some things followed. By the time Brian was a teenager, he'd already learned too much. How to control a room without raising his voice, how to make others feel like they were always one step behind. Back then, I thought it was just growing pains. I told myself he'd outgrow it. But now I saw it clearly. He wasn't acting out. He was repeating. And I know now that leaving his father was only the first step. I had removed the man, but not the influence. And while I was focused on surviving, Brian had been absorbing. He learned that love was something to use, that control was safety, that trust was optional. So no, I wasn't shocked anymore. Not the way I had been at first, not since I saw where it started. And the most painful part wasn't even what he had done. It was realizing that I'd missed the signs, that while I was trying to protect us, the shape of something darker was already forming. But I wasn't the same woman anymore. Not the one who kept her head down, not the one who made herself small. I was no longer interested in being quiet, because I had learned silence doesn't protect you, it erases you. The next morning, I got up with something new in me. Not fury, not sadness, something colder, clearer. I started a list, names, places, records. I wasn't going to ask for help. I was going to bring the truth with me, in a folder, in my voice, in every step. And then I found it. Not a form or a file, but a memory posted online, a photograph, a comment from someone I hadn't heard from in years, mentioning how lovely the service had been. At first, I didn't understand what she meant. Then I looked closer, and I realized they had said goodbye to me. There had been a ceremony, a gathering. People wore black. Someone gave a speech. There were flowers and printed programs and music, a slideshow of my face, smiling at times I barely remembered. Brian hadn't just rewritten the paperwork. He had rewritten the entire ending. I called the place. I used a name I knew wouldn't raise questions. They confirmed it all. A private event, a small memorial, a photo from my old albums, a eulogy spoken by someone I'd never met, all of it planned, all of it staged. And for the first time since this all began, I felt something colder than fear. This wasn't about insurance. This was about power. He wanted to be the center of the story, the grieving son, the one left behind. So I went. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't wear black. I parked far enough not to be noticed. I walked slow, kept my head down, eyes hidden behind sunglasses and a scarf. I stood in the back, and I watched. There was my name on the screen. There was my face in the photo. There were people I hadn't heard from in a decade nodding along as someone spoke about a life I was still living. Brian sat at the front, composed, respectful, his face calm, his body still, his story working. And I understood then, fully, completely, that this wasn't just fraud. It was erasure. It was control. He had taken everything I was and turned it into a backdrop for his performance, a role he had written for himself, a legacy shaped in silence. But now I had seen it. And once you've seen it, once you've stood at the back of a room watching people mourn your name while your heart is still beating, there's no going back. I walked out without a word. No confrontation. Not yet. That would come later. First, I needed to understand how deep the lie went. But one thing was certain now. I wasn't going to disappear quietly. He may have told the story his way, but I was still here, and I was ready to tell it myself. I started with a list. Names, places, possibilities. Not written down, not left anywhere someone might find it, but carried in my head, turning over and over until the plan began to shape itself out of the chaos. I remembered the name of an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in years, not since we worked side by side in a cramped accounting office back before I moved out to the desert. A woman with a sharp tongue, a sharper mind, and a habit of knowing things most people missed. We hadn't kept in touch, not really, but I remembered that she had gone back to school late in life, studied law with a fire I admired, but never thought I'd need. I looked her up that same night, and when I saw that she was practicing now, small time, yes, but honest, I felt something tighten in my chest, something like hope, but heavier. I didn't tell her everything at first. I didn't need to. Just enough to let her see that something had been stolen from me. Something big, something personal. And though I could tell by the sound in her voice that she was skeptical, who wouldn't be? There was something in her that flickered to life, something that still remembered who I was before I disappeared. And she offered to help, not with sympathy, but with structure. The kind of help that starts with digging through records and asking uncomfortable questions. I sent her what I had. Scanned copies of old documents, photos, insurance papers I had once tucked into a folder under my bed. Pieces of me that had somehow survived the fire he tried to set. And while she started pulling legal threads, I started pulling social ones. I reached out to people who had been at the funeral. Not directly, not in ways that could be traced. but through quiet observation, online trails, careful anonymous messages that sounded casual but left doors open for doubt. I knew how people worked. I knew that if you whispered uncertainty into the right ears, the questions would grow on their own. It didn't take much. A comment here, a hint there, a photo uploaded without explanation. I wasn't reckless. I didn't show my face, not yet. But I left breadcrumbs, enough to make people wonder if what they'd been told was really true. It started as curiosity, then discomfort, then disbelief. And I knew, even before I heard it confirmed, that rumors had started to ripple across the quiet pond he thought he had sealed shut. Meanwhile, the lawyer, my old friend, was uncovering more than either of us expected. The insurance documents were riddled with inconsistencies, the timeline didn't line up, and the coroner's signature used to file my death had come from a clinic that hadn't treated me in over 15 years. Even better, the physician listed on the paperwork had retired 2 years ago, and someone had backdated his name onto the file, hoping no one would notice. That kind of mistake? It was gold. She told me, in careful terms, that if we played it right, we wouldn't just get a court hearing, we'd have the foundation for a fraud case big enough to burn everything he touched to the ground. And I wasn't done yet. I started gathering my own proof. Quiet phone calls to agencies, visits to small offices, copies of tax records, medical appointments, even old mail. Anything that showed I had been alive and moving and present in the world during the time he claimed I'd died. I got statements from the power company, from the pharmacy, from the trailer park manager who had watched me walk Lucky every morning for the last 6 months. I even found an old receipt from a vet visit just weeks before my death, and I tucked it away like a weapon. Every piece of paper felt like armor. Every confirmation of my existence felt like a bullet back in the chamber. But the real key, the one that made my hands go cold when I found it, was a voicemail. It was short, just a few seconds long, left by Brian on a day I hadn't answered his call. Maybe a year ago. Maybe more. And I had saved it without thinking, never deleting it, even though I hadn't listened to it in ages. In it, his voice was calm, even friendly. But he mentioned my name, mentioned that he had spoken to me about the insurance, mentioned that I had told him where the documents were. It wasn't incriminating on its own, not exactly, but in the context of everything else, it was devastating. It placed me alive. It placed him aware. It placed motive and access in one simple recording. So I saved it, backed it up, sent a copy to the lawyer, and then I sat at my table, staring out the window as the sun dipped behind the ridge of mountains, and I felt, for the first time since all this began, that I wasn't chasing anymore. I was hunting. He had declared me dead. But now I was coming back. And I wasn't coming back quiet. It started slowly, the way all unravelings do. Not with a crash or an explosion, not with some dramatic confrontation or tearful breakdown, but with a shift in the air, a subtle misalignment in the carefully built image my son had constructed, like a thread coming loose at the edge of a suit no one expected to be examined up close. And it wasn't me who pulled it, not directly, because I had learned long ago that revenge isn't loud. It doesn't draw attention or warn its target. It waits and watches and slips beneath the floorboards until the whole structure begins to rot from underneath. I knew Brian's pride wouldn't let him leave it alone. I knew once the whispers began, once the phone calls came in from confused friends and polite colleagues asking strange questions, once someone in his office overheard someone else saying they thought they saw his dead mother buying tomatoes at a farmer's market. He would start scrambling to plug the holes, to reinforce the narrative, to remind everyone that grief had made him vulnerable and fragile and sincere. But grief can only be stretched so far before it snaps, and the cracks began to show in ways he couldn't control. My lawyer, sharp as ever, quiet as a blade, had started sending inquiries to the insurance company through official channels, each one polite, each one accompanied by documentation that undermined Brian's claims just enough to demand attention. And once the insurance fraud unit began to review the file, the inconsistencies we had uncovered became impossible to ignore. Dates that didn't line up, signatures that didn't match, a payment issued with suspicious speed and without confirmation from next of kin beyond his word. It wasn't enough for charges, not yet, but it was enough to trigger an internal audit, and that audit meant questions. Questions meant tension. Tension meant mistakes, and Brian made them. He called someone he shouldn't have, someone close to the lawyer, someone who'd once been my neighbor, someone who had seen me walking Lucky just 3 days after my supposed death. He left a voicemail that wasn't angry exactly, but full of warning, full of the kind of veiled pressure that only sounds polite if you've never been manipulated before. What he didn't know was that every call, every text, every file he touched now left a digital trail, and we were already watching. Still, there was one thing I hadn't expected, one piece of the story that knocked the air out of me like a punch to the ribs. And it came from a woman named Erin, someone I didn't know, someone I had never met, who emailed my lawyer late one night with a short, nervous message that changed everything. Erin had been dating Brian. Serious, long-term, the kind of relationship where bank accounts get discussed and futures get mapped out. And she had questions. She had noticed the money. She had seen the tension. She had been told stories that didn't add up. Stories about a tragic childhood, a mother who drank, a funeral paid for in quiet shame. And when someone forwarded her a blurry photo from a store security camera showing a woman who looked too much like me to ignore, she stopped believing him. She asked to meet. She didn't want to get involved at first. Who would? But what she told us blew the whole thing open wider than I could have imagined. There was more. Brian hadn't just collected on my policy. He had taken out a second one, hidden under a trust name, set up months before he declared me dead. And it had been processed through a smaller firm that hadn't done due diligence, relying instead on the documentation he submitted, including an obituary he had written himself and a forged affidavit from someone posing as my sister. That second policy was larger, substantial, enough to explain why he'd taken the risk, enough to reveal that this wasn't a desperate mistake. It was a plan, and Erin had proof. She had access to documents he'd carelessly stored on a shared drive, screenshots, emails, payment receipts, enough to trigger a criminal investigation if handled right. I sat at my kitchen table that night, staring at the folder she'd passed to the lawyer, my fingers trembling not with fear but with something heavier, the kind of anger that's too full to move, too thick to rise to the surface, the kind of anger that turns into resolve so dense it makes your breath feel like steel. My son had not only killed me on paper, he had profited from my imagined body twice, wrapped it in stories that painted me as pathetic and broken, used that image to gain sympathy and money and power, and then gone home to smile at himself in the mirror. But the web was breaking now, and he didn't even know the spider was no longer in control. There was a moment just before dawn when I stood outside barefoot on the gravel, the desert air cold against my skin, the stars dimmed by the coming sunrise, and I closed my eyes and let the silence press against me. I had always thought revenge would feel sharp and hot and fast, but what I felt was quiet, almost calm, the knowledge that justice wasn't a storm. It was a tide, slow and steady, and once it started rising, nothing could hold it back. He had spun the lie. He had built the stage. He had invited the world to watch me vanish. But now the curtain was coming down, and I was still standing. There's something almost sacred about choosing the moment you come back from the dead, not just surviving quietly in the shadows, not just clawing your way through bureaucratic walls and digital ghosts, but stepping fully, deliberately, into the daylight and forcing the world to see you as you are. Not broken, not confused, not gone, but awake and watchful and ready. And I knew that when I emerged, it had to be on my terms, not as someone begging for recognition, but as someone demanding accountability, So I waited until the paperwork was airtight, until the investigation had shifted from a whisper to a pulse, until the first letter from the insurance fraud division landed in Brian's mailbox, heavy with legal language and polite threat. I waited until my lawyer confirmed that the Department of Justice had been notified. I waited until I wasn't just alive again, but undeniable. And then I showed up. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't storm into a courtroom or bang on Brian's door or arrive in a blaze of camera flashes. I walked into the same county office that had once looked me in the eye and told me I didn't exist, and I placed every document, every receipt, every stamped confirmation on their counter with the stillness of someone who no longer needed to prove anything, just someone who had returned to claim what was hers. The clerk paled. Her hands trembled. A supervisor was called, then another, and by the end of the hour I had a temporary ID, a reinstated Social Security status, and a file number marked active once again. But the news didn't stay in that building. Within 24 hours, a low-level employee at the funeral home, the one that hosted my memorial, the one that signed off on my ashes, the one that never saw a body, leaked the news to a local reporter, someone who remembered my name, someone who had written the original obituary and now felt a tug of guilt, sharp enough to dig deeper. The story hit the local feed like a flare in the sky, not loud enough for national headlines yet, but bright enough to draw attention. Woman declared dead reemerges, says son faked her death for insurance money. The article ran with an old photo, my eyes half closed, smile soft and small, a face too kind for what the caption accused. I saw the comments flood in. I saw the doubt, the disbelief, the shift. I watched the world tilt slowly in my direction, and somewhere out there, Brian saw it too. He tried to stay quiet at first, tried to let the system speak for him, but when the media requests began to show up, when former co-workers started asking questions, when Erin, his girlfriend, his witness, the woman who knew everything, was spotted entering the district attorney's office with a file folder in her arms, something in him cracked. My lawyer called me late that night, voice taut with restrained excitement, and told me he'd filed a sworn statement claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that he had been misled by faulty records, that someone else, an unnamed source, had given him the documents, and that he was as much a victim as I was. But what he didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that we had already uncovered the final piece: a bank transfer, routed through a burner account, sent to the same man who had signed off on my death certificate, a name that traced back to an old drinking buddy of his father's, a man who had disappeared from his last listed address just 1 week before I came back to life. It was all there now. Motive, method, movement. The noose wasn't just tightening, it was cinching. And for the first time, I felt something like stillness settle over me. Not the quiet of retreat, not the silence of grief or rage, but a kind of peaceful weight that came from knowing the truth wasn't buried anymore. It was standing on its own legs, wearing my name again, walking through the same world that had once refused to see it. But I also knew, instinctively, deeply, that Brian wasn't done, that he would try one last time to flip the script, to reclaim control of the narrative he believed he still owned. He had built his story on control, and without it, he wouldn't survive the shame. So I waited, not with fear, but with certainty. The resurrection was only the beginning. I didn't plan the moment we finally stood across from each other, not in the way you imagine these things when you lie awake at night writing speeches in your head, thinking of clever lines and perfect silences, not with the precision of a courtroom drama or the satisfaction of a cinematic ending. It just happened, like gravity pulling two bodies toward each other across a space that had once been filled with love and now only echoed with the weight of everything unspoken. It was in a hallway just outside the courthouse, neutral ground before a scheduled deposition, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, a plastic chair knocked slightly askew against the wall, and I heard his voice before I saw his face, and for a moment I felt nothing but the mechanical rhythm of my own breath, steady and practiced, like I had trained for this all my life without knowing it. He turned, and there I was, not a ghost, not an image, not a headline or a file or a memory in a slideshow, but flesh and breath and presence. And his expression didn't change right away, not visibly, not in a way anyone else might have noticed, but I saw it. I saw the way his eyes flinched, the way his posture held just a little too still, the way his fingers curled into themselves like someone trying not to drop something fragile. There was no apology in him, no shame, just surprise layered over calculation, and I understood, in that single stretched second, that he had never truly believed I would return, not because he thought I couldn't, but because he thought I wouldn't. He thought I would stay buried, crushed by the weight of what he'd done, paralyzed by the same silence I had once used as a shield when he was younger, and I still believed quiet love could save a person from their worst instincts. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I walked past him without flinching, without a word, without giving him the dignity of acknowledgement, because the story wasn't his anymore. Not the beginning, not the middle, and certainly not the end. He had told his version. He had spun the lie. He had shaped the narrative with paperwork and pity and funeral flowers that had already wilted. Now it was my turn. And I didn't need to raise my voice or point a finger. I just needed to keep walking, keep breathing, keep standing in every room they had tried to remove me from. And still, he followed. He caught up to me, not with words, but with presence, walking 2 steps behind, matching my pace, like he thought proximity could equal control, like if he just stayed close enough, he could still guide the fall. But I felt nothing now. Not fear, not guilt, not the trembling ache of betrayal. Only distance, pure and absolute, the kind that isn't measured in miles but in years, in silences, in choices that stack like bricks until you've built a wall you can't even see over anymore. We sat in the same room minutes later, me on one side of the long table, him on the other, papers spread between us like the bones of the dead, and I didn't look at him again. Not once. Not even when the lawyer asked him questions that made the color drain from his face. Not even when the file was opened that contained the second policy, the forged affidavits, the screenshots from Aaron's computer, the money trail, the voice recordings, the signatures from men now under investigation for their part in the scheme. He tried to speak once, tried to interrupt, to redirect, to insert himself into the center of a narrative that was already slipping through his fingers. But it was too late, and we all knew it. The timeline didn't hold. The paperwork didn't match. The performance had lost its audience. The lies, once polished and smooth, now cracked under the weight of evidence so clear even he stopped pretending to deny it. I sat there, silent and still, while his lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and the room filled with the quiet sound of unraveling power. No one asked me how it felt to be declared dead. No one apologized for believing him. They just kept reading, flipping page after page after page. And that's when it happened. The first twist, sharp and sudden, like a trapdoor snapping open beneath his feet. Because in his attempt to bury me, in his arrogance, in the belief that no one would look too closely, he had failed to realize that not only had he broken the law, he had done it using the identity of someone else, someone long deceased, someone whose name he had used on a forged witness affidavit that tied the entire scheme together. And that name? It belonged to his father, a man who had died 2 years earlier under questionable circumstances. No funeral, no obituary, just a quiet disappearance into the desert. And now, through paperwork and carelessness, Brian had essentially confessed to knowing more about that death than he had ever admitted. The prosecutors weren't just looking at insurance fraud now. They were looking at something deeper, something colder, something criminal in a different way. And though no one said it out loud in that moment, I saw the shift in the room, saw the lawyer stiffen, saw the assistant DA glance at the folder with something close to alarm. Brian didn't see it. Not yet, but I did. I saw the door open, and I knew that the second twist was coming. It didn't happen all at once, not like in the movies where the guilty slam their fists on a table and scream their confessions, not like some televised courtroom scene where the judge bangs a gavel and truth snaps into place with a clean, final sound. It happened in pieces, slow and grinding, like the earth shifting under the weight of something ancient, finally waking up. In the weeks after the deposition, after the files were handed over and the questions deepened and the media circled like moths around the strange flame of my resurrection, the story took on a life of its own, no longer mine alone, no longer confined to whispers and small-town rumor, but printed and shared and repeated until even strangers with no stake in it began to feel the pulse of outrage beneath the surface. I watched it unfold with a detachment I hadn't expected. Not numbness, but something quieter, colder, the stillness of someone who had already felt every possible version of grief and now simply waited for the final breath to leave the lie. Brian was charged with multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and falsifying official documents. The second insurance policy sealed it. The forged witness affidavit using his dead father's name opened the door to something darker. And when forensic accountants started tracing payments made years earlier, payments that aligned eerily with the timing of that man's disappearance, the case widened beyond anything he could control. He was arrested on a Thursday morning, handcuffed outside his office in full view of the staff he'd once paraded past like a success story. And I watched the footage on a tiny screen from the corner of a gas station diner, the volume off, the faces blurred, the headline scrolling beneath the image in bold white letters that said what I never needed to say aloud: man arrested for faking mother's death to collect insurance money. But the real twist came after. I had expected a trial. I had expected a plea deal. I had expected some version of legal justice, months, maybe years in a prison cell, some restitution, a televised apology he didn't mean. I thought that was what closure would look like. But instead, on the night before his formal arraignment, Brian tried to run. The report said he'd withdrawn cash, changed phones, packed a bag. There was a plan, poorly constructed but urgent, and it ended with him found just over the state line, not dead, not hurt, just cornered in a borrowed car behind a closed mechanic's yard, alone and exhausted, and no longer holding on to the persona he had built so carefully. They brought him back in silence. No struggle, no statement. Just a man who had finally stopped pretending the story was his to control. And when they searched his apartment, they found something that knocked the breath from me more than any lie ever had. A file, hidden beneath floorboards, full of notes, receipts, old photographs of me, even torn-up letters I'd written him years ago, never mailed, notes he must have taken from my trailer long ago when I still trusted him enough to let him in. And on one of those letters, the last line had been underlined. It wasn't anything special, just a sentence about love, about how despite everything, I still hoped we'd find our way back to each other. And I saw, in that moment, that this hadn't been just greed. It hadn't even been hate. It had been need. A twisted, broken need to control what couldn't be healed. But that didn't excuse it. It only made it more tragic. The judge denied bail, the charges held, the trial moved forward, and I moved on. Not quickly, not dramatically. I didn't change my name or move to a new city or write a memoir. I stayed in my trailer, planted new flowers outside the steps, took Lucky on longer walks, paid my bills on time, and slowly began rebuilding the version of myself that had been stolen and broken and buried. I became a woman people whispered about in grocery stores, the one who came back from the dead, the one who took down her own son, the one whose strength made people uncomfortable because they saw in me what they feared in themselves: survival, without apology. But I never told the full story. Not to the papers, not to the reporters who came with cameras and hopeful faces, not to the strangers who asked for interviews or book rights or documentary pitches, because the truth wasn't in the scandal. It was in the silence that came afterward, in the peace of being real again, in the heaviness of having been hated by someone you loved beyond measure, in the softness of waking each morning and remembering not what was lost, but what was reclaimed. And maybe that's the real ending, not the handcuffs, not the headlines, but me, here, alive, truly alive, again.